The first lie a collapsing city tells is simple. If nothing comes out of the tap, the water is gone. That is how most people think. They confuse pressure with supply, motion with existence. A machine stops humming, a faucet coughs air, and in the public mind, the entire system becomes a corpse overnight. But infrastructure does not die that cleanly. It dies in layers. First, the electricity fails. Then the pumps stop. Then distribution breaks. Then trust breaks. And only after that does the city begin to empty out physically. That delay matters, because inside that gap between visible failure and actual depletion, there is a window where people who understand systems live very differently from people who only understand appliances. A fire hydrant is one of the clearest symbols of that gap. For most of your life, it was background scenery. Red, yellow, chipped paint, bolted to the curb, useful only to firefighters and dogs. But in a grid failure, a hydrant stops being street furniture and becomes evidence. Evidence that beneath the pavement is still a buried volume of treated water, trapped in darkness, insulated by soil, protected from sunlight, sealed inside a network. Most people will mentally abandon the moment their kitchen sink runs dry. The average person looks at a silent hydrant and sees nothing. The strategic mind sees stored mass. That difference is everything, because collapse is not just scarcity, it is misperception. The crowd does not starve, only because resources are limited. The crowd starves because it stampedes toward the obvious and ignores the concealed. Grocery aisles get stripped in hours because food is visible. Gas stations become war zones because fuel is legible. Swimming pools get noticed. Rivers get noticed. Bottled water gets noticed. But buried municipal infrastructure does not trigger the same primitive response, because humans are wired to chase what looks available right now, not what still exists inside a dead system waiting for extraction. And cities are full of those blind spots. The modern world trains people to interact with finished surfaces. Turn the handle, press the button, swipe the card. Few people think in terms of what sits behind the wall, below the road, upstream of the valve, or downhill from the reservoir. They know interfaces, not systems. That is why a failed city becomes a hunting ground for anyone who can think one layer deeper, not because they are stronger, not because they are more ruthless. Because they understand that infrastructure retains inventory after it loses convenience. That principle goes far beyond water. It applies to fuel in lines, heat in buildings, medicine in clinics, calories in warehouses, and value in scrap. But water is where the lesson becomes brutal fastest, because thirst turns theory into hierarchy. After about a day without reliable intake, people stop behaving like citizens and start behaving like organisms. Judgment narrows, distance feels longer, rumors gain value, crowds thicken around whatever seems immediate. And once desperation enters, people begin draining what is easiest to reach, not what is smartest to protect. That is why the hydrant matters, not because it is magic, not because every one of them is a miracle well, and not because pulling from municipal infrastructure is simple, clean, or risk-free. It matters because it reveals a deeper rule of collapse that most people never learn until it is too late. A system can fail at the user end while still holding immense residual value inside its body. The city may stop serving you long before the city is actually empty. And that creates the real question, not whether water is somewhere under the street. In many places, it is. The real question is, what happens next? What contamination does to trapped water? What gravity does to one block versus another? What happens when everyone else realizes there is still something underground worth fighting over? And most importantly, why the hydrant itself is only the visible tip of a much larger survival map hidden in plain sight. Because once you understand what a dead hydrant actually means, you stop seeing a city as a failed machine. You start seeing it as a carcass full of sealed compartments. Once you accept that a dead system can still contain water, the next illusion has to die too, that access is the same as ownership. It is not. In collapse, the existence of a resource means almost nothing by itself. What matters is whether you can reach it, move it, protect it, and keep it cleaner than the alternatives. That is where most survival thinking falls apart. People imagine discovery as victory. They find the thing in their mind, and the story ends there. But a hydrant is not a treasure chest. It is a connection point into a larger hydraulic landscape, and that landscape obeys terrain, gravity, pipe geometry, stagnation, and time. Water in a municipal network does not sit inside the city like a giant underground lake waiting politely for whoever opens the nearest valve. It sits inside long, segmented arteries. Some sections remain full, others partially drain. Elevation changes matter. Breaks in the line matter. Opened fixtures elsewhere matter. A neighborhood on favorable grade can hold trapped volume longer than one downhill from multiple leaks. A quiet suburb on a sealed branch can behave very differently from an old commercial district full of damaged mains, backflow paths, and constant scavenger traffic. Two hydrants 3 streets apart can represent completely different situations. That is the first upgrade in thinking. Stop seeing hydrants as individual objects. Start seeing them as markers on a buried map. Because the city under your feet is not flat, even if it looks flat, water always settles into the rules of topography. It does not care about property lines, neighborhoods, or your plans. It moves according to height, head pressure, friction loss, and whatever openings now exist in the system. If pressure dies and the network is still largely sealed, large volumes can remain trapped for a while. If there are ruptures downhill, that stored water is already on borrowed time. If multiple people start opening low points, they are not just collecting water, they are silently draining the chances of everyone upstream, and that is where crowd behavior enters. Most people under stress do not think hydrologically. They think socially. They go where others are going. They copy visible success. The first person seen getting water from an obvious location creates traffic. Traffic creates attention. Attention creates rumors. Rumors create conflict. In a crisis, the best resource is often not the biggest one. It is the one that stays below the crowd's imagination longest. This is why visible urban resources become dangerous even when they are abundant. The moment extraction becomes public, the resource is no longer purely physical. It becomes psychological terrain. A hydrant on a main road might hold water. It might also become the center of a line, then an argument, then a territorial node. Meanwhile, a less obvious branch line in a quieter area may hold less water, but more actual survival value because access is intermittent, discreet, and lower profile. In collapse, secrecy often beats volume. Then there is contamination. People love the fantasy that city water is treated, so it must still be safe. That is only half true, and half-truths kill. Treated water starts cleaner than pond water, canal water, drainage ditch water, or most scavenged surface sources. That matters. But chlorine residual fades. Pipe interiors are not magical. Pressure loss changes intrusion risk. A break in the line can allow dirty water, soil, and microorganisms to enter. Stagnation changes taste and odor. Sediment can get stirred. In warm climates, timelines shorten. In damaged areas, uncertainty expands. So the correct doctrine is neither blind trust nor blind rejection. It is this: municipally trapped water may be one of the best remaining sources in early system failure, but it is still scavenged water now. Treat it like a prize that can betray you. That means filtration where possible, boiling where fuel allows, chemical disinfection when appropriate, settling if sediment is present, containers kept cleaner than the source point, retrieval done with discipline, not thirst-driven haste, because the person who secures 200 gallons and contaminates the whole batch through sloppy handling has not solved a water problem. He has converted it into a medical one, and time is working in the background the entire time. Every hour after failure changes the equation. More leaks, more users, more awareness, more contamination opportunities, more pressure from desperate neighbors, which means the real value of understanding a hydrant is not that it gives you an eternal answer. It gives you a temporary edge inside a narrowing window. A city in the first phase of water loss is not the same city 3 days later, and 3 days later is not the same city after people start moving with tools instead of hope. Which raises the harder question no one wants to face. If dead infrastructure still holds value, then the real contest is no longer about finding resources. It is about controlling the hidden geometry of who drains first, who stays supplied, and who realizes too late that the street was never empty at all. Once people understand that water may still be trapped underground, the problem changes from survival to competition. And competition in a failing city is rarely loud at first. It begins as invisible subtraction. Someone downhill opens a line and lets gravity do the work. Someone else finds a leak and widens it. A maintenance valve gets turned without anyone nearby even knowing what was lost. A branch main that could have fed 20 families for days becomes an empty pipe because one person treated the system like a pond instead of a network. This is the second hidden layer most people miss. In urban collapse, resources are connected. You are not only collecting, you are altering the map. That makes infrastructure knowledge more valuable than raw strength. A hydrant is not just access to water. It is a clue that there are valves nearby, branch lines, isolation points, elevation advantages, and dead-end sections that can behave like buried cisterns if left intact. In a functioning city, those details are administrative trivia. In a failed city, they become strategic terrain. The person who understands where the line runs, where it forks, and which section can be isolated is not merely finding water. He is deciding whether water remains available at all. This is where one of the biggest prepper myths collapses. The myth that survival is mainly about stockpiles. Stockpiles matter. Of course they matter. But a fixed pile only buys time. System knowledge creates options, and in a drawn-out failure, options outrank inventory. A man with 3 months of supplies but no understanding of his environment can still get cornered by heat, illness, neighbors, fire, or movement pressure. A smaller, less glamorous advantage knowing how the district drains after rain, which clinic has backup power, which hill keeps cell signal, which street sits above the main break, which hydrants connect to quieter branches can outperform expensive gear because it changes your decisions before panic sets in. Cities reward that kind of thinking because cities are dense with leftovers from normal life: metal, water, fuel, anchors, shelter, line of sight, transit corridors, bottlenecks, thermal mass, drainage routes, backup systems. But all of it is distributed unevenly. Geography decides what remains usable. Low ground floods first. High ground keeps visibility and often signal. Dense commercial zones hold more inventory but attract more eyes. Residential edges may offer quieter access but fewer tools. Industrial belts can be treasure or poison depending on what was stored there and what burned nearby. Collapse does not flatten the city. It reveals its gradients. And the hydrant sits right at the center of that revelation because it is both water infrastructure and a marker of how engineered space really works. Where there is one hydrant, there is a branch connection, buried hardware, maintenance logic, municipal planning, and almost always a surrounding pattern. Intersections, lot lines, road grade, pump zones, nearby valves, commercial density, truck access, all of these tell you something. The people who survive cities under pressure are often the ones who stop seeing isolated objects and start reading systems like tracks in mud. There is another myth that needs to be broken here too. The belief that the most dangerous phase begins when resources are gone. No, the dangerous phase begins when resources still exist, but trust in access is collapsing. That is when people become volatile, when some homes still have a little stored water and others have none. When one block hears a rumor about supply coming back, and another has already started hauling from creeks, when a few people know where to pull cleaner water, and the rest are improvising with buckets in hope. Scarcity by itself is brutal. Uneven scarcity is explosive. Human beings can tolerate hardship better than they tolerate watching someone nearby navigate hardship more effectively. That means any useful resource node has a shadow cost. A good water point is also a place where visibility, routine, and envy accumulate. The more reliable your extraction pattern becomes, the more you risk teaching the area around you what matters. Repetition makes you legible. Legibility makes you targetable. This is why mature survival behavior is never just about obtaining the resource. It is about managing signature, noise, timing, foot traffic, storage, transport, smell, light, even body language. All of it can advertise competence to people who are increasingly desperate. And this is where the hydrant stops being a clever trick and becomes a hard lesson in doctrine, because the real value was never the red post on the curb. The real value was the mental model it forces on you. The understanding that systems fail unevenly, that residual inventory hides inside dead machinery, that terrain decides access, that crowds drain the obvious first, that every visible resource becomes social friction the moment others notice, and that the winner in the early phase of collapse is often not the one with the most supplies, but the one who can read the living remnants inside dead infrastructure. Which leads to the final question. If survival in a failing city depends less on what you own and more on whether you can correctly read what still exists, then what other dead parts of the modern world are full of trapped value people will walk past until it is too late? That is the doctrine the hydrant teaches. Collapse does not erase the world, it scrambles it. Most people imagine disaster as a clean break between before and after. Before, systems work. After, everything is gone. But reality is harsher and more complicated. The power is out, but batteries still hold charge. Stores are closed, but warehouses are still full. Clinics are overwhelmed, but medicine still exists in cabinets, carts, and locked rooms. Pipes lose pressure, but water remains in mains, towers, heaters, boilers, and trapped loops. The city does not become empty in one moment. It becomes unreadable to people who only know how to consume its finished services. That is why so many fail early. They do not know how to think past the interface. They know the faucet, not the pipe, the gas pump, not the tank farm, the supermarket shelf, not the loading dock, the traffic light, not the intersection geometry. They are waiting for the world to present resources in the same polite format it used during peacetime. And when that format disappears, they conclude the resource itself is gone. That is not survival failure. That is perception failure. The people who do better are usually operating from a colder principle. Function can disappear long before material disappears. A dead building still contains insulation, copper, stored heat, shade, drainage, glass, wiring, anchors, containers, tools, and sometimes water. A dead vehicle is still a battery bank, a seat, a shelter shell, a mirror, a pulley source, a fuel container, a rolling cache, and a map of what roads are still passable. A dead neighborhood is still roof area, gravity, gutters, brick, thermal mass, alleyways, choke points, and salvage. What matters is not whether civilization is working. What matters is whether you can still read the residue of civilization faster than everyone else. That is the hidden divide in every crisis. One group keeps asking, why isn't it working? The other asks, what is still physically here? The first group waits for restoration. The second starts calculating. But calculation alone is not enough. Because once you see the hidden inventory of a broken city, greed becomes a trap. This is where amateurs destroy themselves. They discover one useful node and turn it into a fantasy of unlimited extraction. They overharvest. They expose themselves. They make patterns. They attract followers, questions, resentment, and eventually force. They mistake a temporary asymmetry for permanent control. In collapse, a resource is only yours for as long as your use of it remains proportional, quiet, and sustainable. That is the final correction to the scavenger mindset. Do not think like a looter. Think like a systems naturalist. A looter sees isolated prizes. A systems naturalist sees flows, dependencies, bottlenecks, and decay curves. A looter asks what can be taken today. A systems naturalist asks what action today ruins next week. A looter empties. A systems naturalist preserves, isolates, rotates, conceals, and leaves options open. That is the deeper reason the hydrant matters. Not because it promises some cinematic endless stream under every street. Sometimes the line will be drained. Sometimes it will be contaminated. Sometimes it will be too exposed to use safely. Sometimes the smarter move will be to leave it alone entirely. The lesson is bigger than the object. The lesson is that survival belongs to the people who can distinguish between a system that has stopped serving and a system that has actually been emptied. Those are not the same thing. And in every real collapse, that difference becomes a form of power. So remember the principle. When the crowd says it's gone, check whether it is merely offline. When the interface dies, look for the inventory behind it. When panic drives everyone toward the visible, start asking what remains. Trapped, buried, sealed, shaded, elevated, insulated, or ignored. Because the first stage of collapse is not the disappearance of resources, it is the disappearance of understanding. And the people who survive longest are usually the ones who can still read the city after it stops speaking in plain language. If you want more scripts that break down collapse, infrastructure, and survival doctrine at the level most people never look at, stay with the channel.